Okay, let's start the second part of the this morning's session, and the speaker is Professor Shafi Goldwasser. She's now the director of the Simons Institute for Theory of Computing at Berkeley. She's still, as far as I know, still also at MIT, right? Still the RSA professor in electrical engineering and computer science department at MIT, and she's also a professor of computer science at the Weizmann Institute here in Israel. Her fields include, as I'm sure you know, computational complexity, cryptography, computational number theory, and she's the inventor and pioneer of many areas in modern computer science, probabilistic encryption, zero-knowledge proofs, hardness of approximation, and many other things. She's the recipient of the 2012 Turing Award, together with Silvio Micali at MIT. She won twice the Gödel Award for theoretical computer science, and I will not, it's really a very, very long list, and I will not go through it. And she's my next door neighbor at the Weizmann Institute.
Thank you. So the title of this symposium was Computer Science and its Impact on its Future. So I decided that I'll change my title to be Cryptography and its Impact on our past and future. And that's true both for theory of computing and for practice of computer science. So this talk is extremely ambitious in the sense that it's trying to address the past, the future, somewhat the present, also people in the audience who know this material and people in the audience who don't. So we will see how it goes. So in any case, if we start with the past, I just want to say a word that there are these two kind of giants of people who are historically the big people who brought this field into being, Claude Shannon and Alan Turing, and both of them, curiously, had a very strong interest in cryptography. Claude Shannon is well known as the inventor of information theory in this paper, Mathematical Theory of Communication, but it's less known that he was also the author of a paper that came about the same time. In fact, he said himself that both of these were intertwined in his mind, but it was published much later because it was classified, and that was called the Communication Theory of Secrecy Systems. So he was interested really in how do you define a system that has secrecy properties to it, communication system which provides secrecy, and how do you define secrecy. And Alan Turing is like the inventor of the universal Turing machine, so he's an inventor in some sense of the modern computer or the computer, the universal computer. But he's probably more well known to the public as someone who's seen the movie Breaking the Enigma, as someone who broke the code, the German code, using mathematics. Okay, but the slide, besides sort of saying that cryptography and computer science was intertwined in the minds of these two people, the slide also is interesting because these two apparently did their research during wartime. And the reason for the research at the time was really the war with Germany, and they wanted to kind of come up with communication systems or break the German code, and therefore developed a whole mathematical theory for it. And this is where we depart. So in the story of modern cryptography, which is what I'm going to be focused on, and hopefully mostly about the future, is not just about fighting the bad guys, meaning it's not a wartime research. It's research really that was taking place in university. It often starts with very basic research, kind of basic toy problems that people were interested in because they were intellectually fascinating. And it's fairly interesting how much impact it's had, both on the world of theory, and that might be not so surprising, theory of computer science, but also impact on the real world. So when this title of the conference was Computer Science and its Impact on Our Future, we could mean that's the future of academics and theory, but also I think you meant the future of the world. And I think cryptography is kind of a very interesting story. For somebody who will write the history of the sort of development of science, then it's a very interesting story where it really does start from a basic research point of view and has quite a bit of impact. So for this talk, what I want to do, and as I said, it's kind of ambitious, is to, just like a slide or two, tell you that I believe, and I think it's fairly clear when you see what I'm talking about, that it's enabled very surprising abilities of thinking cryptographically in the field of cryptography, which often, if you just describe them without seeing how you do it, just the fact that you can do it, it seems like that's impossible, physically impossible. I know that there's some physicists in the audience. I don't necessarily mean physics, but maybe even yes. To begin with, it sounds like that's not possible, but it is. It's been a catalyst, as I said, to a bunch of really intellectual leaps in the theory of computing, like the interactive proof systems and some other things that I'll allude to. But more to the talk today, its impact on the world has been, everybody knows its impact in terms of electronic commerce, that we can buy things on the internet, we can exchange messages, we can withdraw money from bank and so forth. All this electronic commerce will not have been possible without the modern cryptography. That's just a fact. So I always love to quote, but this is for Hebrew because I don't know how to translate it into English. There's the book by, Satan Moskva. How do you translate? That's right. And there's some point where they're debating the Satan and about whether God exists or not. And he says, exists וזהו, קיים וזהו. So the point is that that is a fact. So in any case, and for the future, this is more anticipatory, yes. There's a lot of evidence to it, but it's not commonplace yet. I believe that the kind of cryptography that I'm going to talk about in this lecture will enable us to take advantage of the fact that we have a lot of data today, and we have a lot of global connectivity, and the fact that we can take advantage of it, and we already know. The question is whether we can do that while keeping intact our our right to be left alone. And this is not a quote due to me, obviously. This is due to Judge Brandeis. And he says, I don't know if people agree with it today, probably not, but he says the right most valued by all civilized men, and women I assume, is the right to be left alone. So there was something very inherent and clear to him, that they required no, kayam vezeu, required no justification that this is the thing we most value. It's very hard to think of it in the society of today, But my claim is that cryptography, in principle, allows this. So it is possible to allow this, and I'll put this qualification to the full extent possible. So what do I mean by that? I don't mean that, well, it's all out there, what can we do now? What I mean is if you mathematically define what it is that you're trying to achieve by taking advantage, okay, precisely what it is that you want to get out of data, then you can enable that with techniques that will deliver only that and nothing else. They won't release more about you and reveal more data about you than necessary for the task itself. Okay, so that's my plan to convince you of these four things. So first of all, what surprising abilities am I talking about? Please interrupt me if you like in the middle of the talk, otherwise who knows where you are at. Okay, so what surprising abilities am I talking about? So again, people who follow this, they know. I will try to say some kind of English words associated with each one of these abilities. So first of all, the fact that you can send messages across the internet without ever, or buy things across the internet without ever introducing yourself in person to whoever it is you're communicating with. But there's some secret methods. So there's some method, secret in the sense that most people don't know how it works, that enables you to do so, and somehow you all trust it. You are buying things, you're exchanging messages, you are withdrawing money, and you believe that this is done in a way that you're not completely giving everything away. And it is because of something called public key cryptography. Another thing is, for example, that maybe less people are aware of, is that you could sign contracts now simultaneously over the internet, okay? In the sense that I won't sign if and only if you sign. So contract signing means we both have to be present at the same time. Somehow you can achieve the simultaneity, the effect of simultaneity, even though you're not present physically in the same place, because of cryptography. And I don't mean the kind of digital signatures that you guys attach to contracts, because obviously those can be removed and put in somebody else's contract. I mean a much more sophisticated way of doing so that really does guarantee the simultaneity. Another thing is zero-knowledge proofs of every theorem or everyday theorem, and I'll talk more about that. So zero-knowledge proof, again, proof sounds like it's totally mathematical and dedicated to mathematical theorems, but that's not the case. A lot of statements that we use in everyday life, and I will explain examples of it later in the talk, can be done so you can believe the validity of these statements, but you have learned, but I haven't actually given you more than that, just the belief of the validity. I haven't given you details that you don't need to know except the fact that the statement is correct. And that could be that you are the right user to enter a system. It could be that you're compliant with rules. Let's say your tax returns are actually filed in accordance with the rules of tax without actually giving the details of your tax return. It could be that you are government and what you're doing is compliant with rules, even though you're not going to give all the details. We'll see later, but just as a hint of where I'm going with that. Another thing you can do is playing games without referees. I won't exact private information retrieval. You can retrieve information from public databases without revealing what it is you're looking for. Arbitrary computations on encrypted data is very important. So it's another thing we'll talk about later. So even though data is encrypted, we're going to be able to do computations on it without decrypting it first. So that's an ability which is unclear. It's encrypted, so you can't actually see it, but you can still compute on it. So these are all kinds of abilities which, if we had time, I would convince you paradoxical, and then I would unconvince you, because I would show you how to do it with these means of modern cryptography. And I just want to say that I will focus more later on these two things, the zero-knowledge proofs of everyday theorems and these arbitrary computations on encrypted data, because this will be very important for machine learning, which was in the title of my talk to begin with, but safe machine learning. And this will be important to a new interest that's emerging in the field, and I'm also very interested in it. I'll end my talk with it, which is how to use cryptography in law. And this is often when people talk about algorithms in law or cryptography in the law, they're thinking about how we are going to make sure that machine learning doesn't run away with it, and we'll make sure that there are laws to restrict it. I actually mean the other way around. Not how to bring a body of law to restrict algorithms, but rather to bring tools from cryptography to be able to do legal things which we don't know how to do now. So there's a lot of law. I mean, and I'm not talking about this just because I like to pontificate. Maybe I do, but that's because I've been talking to lawyers, and there seems to be that there's the spirit of the law, and then there's what you can do. So you try to execute the spirit of the law with the means you have in your hands. So my thesis here is that the cryptographic tools that we have can enable to do things more precisely as the spirit intended. Okay, so that's just the head. All right. So these are these abilities, and as you notice, it looks like a hodgepodge. It's like a bag, like my bag. I mean, if you looked at it, you would understand. There's lots of things, theorems proving zero knowledge, computing on encrypted data, simultaneous contract signing, electronic commerce. It just seems like everything that I've ever been interested in I put on that slide. There's some truth to that, but not really. So there is something in common among all these tools, among all these examples, and that is, in all of these examples, what's common is that there is an adversary. Okay, so these things, and I'll use this picture always to talk about the adversary. So the adversary is present, let's say, in the case of signing a contract, the adversary might be one of the two players. I would like you to sign the contract before I sign it, okay? In the case of computing on encrypted data, the adversary might want to know what the data is, okay, in addition to the result of the computation. In the case of generating random numbers, which are pseudo-random numbers which are indistinguishable from random, the adversary might be someone who's trying to distinguish whether it was random or pseudo-random. Even in the case of a mathematical proof, there's an adversary. We usually don't think about it, but the process of verifying mathematical proof is really the process of making sure there are no mistakes. Who's the adversary? The adversary is whoever's trying to convince you of the theorem and has made a mistake. Okay, so I'm not saying that an active person who writes a mathematical paper is an adversary who's trying to fool everyone, but this is the assumption that we should have in our mind when we're verifying the theorem, that there is an adversary, and we, unless he's not adversarial, we'll only accept if it's honest. Okay, so in any case, why is it so important to talk about the adversary? So first of all, because it's a common thread to all these surprising abilities of cryptography. Second of all, it kind of makes you understand kind of the aesthetics of this field, meaning that, first of all, an adversary here is not just superfluous. He's really an integral part of the definition of the problem. So there's no point to talk about encryption unless there's an adversary. If nobody's listening, there's no problem, It's just so integral that the problem is defined really because there is an adversary. And also, who that adversary is will determine the quality of acceptable solutions. So we've seen 2 talks on quantum computers and their applications, and yesterday also the 2 talks by Charlie Bennett and Adi Stern. And today the adversary is classical. What they're saying is maybe tomorrow the adversary is quantum, okay? And whoever that adversary is will determine whether this is a good solution or not, okay? So you can think about it as when you're giving a solution, it says, this is the adversary that I'm concerned with, and I will prove everything rigorously with respect to that adversary. Does not mean that it transfers to the new adversary, let's say, for example, classical to quantum, or an adversary who has other access to your system rather than the one you intended to begin with. But part of what we're doing today is trying to show that a lot of the methods that we have do extend, let's say, to quantum. But first we have to define, of course, what the abilities of that quantum adversary is, and then we can go and proceed and try to prove that it's robust to it. And just one more thing to say about this adversarial approach is that I think that it's a key approach in any case to analyze any complex system. You really don't know what's going to go wrong. If you're just going to enumerate all possibilities of what's going to go wrong, you're surely going to miss something out. So you would like to design something that's robust in front of the worst case adversary is sort of the best guarantee that a complex system actually is correct. So in fact, we're going to not assume that we know how the adversary strategy is, because then we are restricting ourselves to particular strategies and the adversary may do something else. So we want to sort of say the adversary can do anything. But we are restricting it somewhat, and that is we're going to assume that he's computationally bounded. He cannot have infinite computation power. So he's a feasible adversary. So if it's an adversary that can work for more number of steps than the atoms in the universe, we're saying is none of our concern. And that is what is going to actually enable breaking that paradox that I said about what's impossible. What seems impossible is actually possible once you restrict your adversary to be computationally bounded. And similarly, this has nothing to do with classical versus quantum. Also, the quantum computers, as beautiful as they are, have computational limitations in the sense that they don't have infinite amount of time, they don't have infinite amount of space. They have some other abilities in computation, but it's not expanding the resources from, let's say, polynomial to exponential. So I think this is a realistic, okay, and it will definitely have great power in enlarging the applications possible. And then there's just two more things about our aesthetics, is that we sort of have this, and this is throughout all the work on cryptography, we have 2 notions which have been introduced in this field. One of them is of computational indistinguishability. So we're saying that often if you look at the techniques in this work, you come to this situation where there's an adversary on one side, and on the other side, and he can press a button and get a sample of one distribution or another distribution, of some string, let's say, okay? And he cannot, to say that these 2 distributions are, we say that they are the same, essentially, with respect to the adversary, if he cannot tell them apart. He cannot know whether he's getting samples from the first distribution or the second distribution efficiently, okay? And this has been applied to encryption, to pseudo-randomness, to this notion of simultaneity, of contract signing, even to correctness. In any case, this is very useful, and this enables us to prove interesting theorems. So, for example, if we apply it to encryption, then we may think about this first distribution as the encryption of one message, the second distribution is the encryption of another message, and we're getting encryptions of this or that, and the adversary can't tell which. So there's lots of encryptions of message 1, lots of encryption of message 2. Every time he presses a sample, he gets encryption of one of those messages, the same one, and he cannot tell if he presses as much time as he can, which is not exponential time, tell them apart. And an encryption system that you can prove satisfies this definition has other properties, like it hides all partial information and other things that you would want from an encryption system. So it's a good way to define an encryption system's security by this indistinguishability. Same thing as for protocols, but let's, okay, sorry. So axiom 2 is that if you can, okay, so this is more for the specialists, but the mathematicians in the audience, but I'll say it anyway, because I think you are the majority in any case. Another axiom is that we say, so there's an adversary, say, in some cryptographic system, and he's Alice and Bob, if you like, but Bob is bad. Alice is always good. So in any case, they're interacting back and forth, and you're saying maybe in this interaction Alice is revealing all her secrets or whatever, okay? It could be that in addition to the fact that there's some functionality in this contract signing, say if it's a contract signing or some other functionality, access to Amazon account or so forth, in addition, you're also releasing your password, your, I don't know, everything else about you. So you're saying, we will say that's not the case if this adversary could have actually simulated, could have come up in his own, in the basement without talking to Alice, could have come up with samples of what he sees when he talks to her on his own. So functionality will still be achieved when he talks to her. But we want to say not functionality and nothing else, because the else is what he sees in the conversation in addition to the functionality, and we say these are things he can do on his own. Okay, close parentheses. Again, this really, if you can show that about your system, that it satisfies the simulation property, then you can show many, many things. You can show security under composition and so forth. And that's, in some sense, why this definition has been so useful and for cryptography. Okay, I said that this was catalytic to a lot of theory, and after this, we move to a mode where we talk about the future, okay? So this is really a slide for people in the theory of computing and mathematics, saying that really things that seem nothing to do with complexity theory, like zero-knowledge proofs, or pseudo-random number generators, hardcore beat proofs, oblivious transfer, introduced by Michael Rabin, and techniques for average case hardness, all these things are relevant to cryptography. Either they're primitives or they're notions of security, like average case versus worst case. But the notions were robust enough, okay, that they led to a sequence really of developments in theoretical computer science. So in terms of zero-knowledge proofs, it brought upon this idea of a probabilistic proof system, a proof that can be checked just by checking it in red. Take a classical proof, encode it in this way, this probabilistically checkable proof, and now you just have to sample the proof very little and not read the whole thing, and if there was an error somewhere, there will be an error that you will detect in your samples. So this is something that was brought on by these new types of proofs. And led to these hardness approximation theories, very surprising. Then both of the hardcore bit proofs and oblivious transfer, through a sequence of developments, have really led to a major breakthrough in algorithmic coding theory. So coding theory used to be more, the classical way that you think about coding theory is that you have a message, you encode it so that if it goes through a channel that introduces errors, on the other side, when the recipient gets it, he can undo the errors and find out what you sent. But there are other notions, and that is maybe cannot find the message, maybe can find a list of candidate messages. That's called list decoding. Can it be done that if by getting just a list and not a single one, you could tolerate a lot more errors? And this was sort of a conjecture till some theorems were proved that shown that yes, and not only for general abstract theory codes, but for codes that people are really using in practice, up to the fact that you could get explicit codes which achieve the best list decoding bound. Another thing is that these days there are codes where instead of having to read the entire transmitted coded message in order to be able to undo the errors, you again can only look locally at a neighborhood, not a very small neighborhood, but less than looking at the whole message, and recover. So these are locally decodable codes. And then there's a whole field called property testing that is also sort of a result of going from, it's a result of something that was done in crypto. In any case, I just sort of want to say that there's been a lot of sort of theory that has come out of these toy problems that have to do just with a sort of intellectual appeal, cryptographic appeal. Okay, so let's now go and talk about impact in the world at large, okay? So for one thing, this is something that's already true, and next I want to talk about what's coming. So what do I mean by already true? Electronic commerce, we talked about. That's the result of public key cryptography. You know, these days people talk a lot about Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, many different kind of currencies. Apparently there's like 2,000 coins out there. Some of them are more well-known, some of them less well-known. All of them are enabled, okay, for good or for bad, by cryptography. So there's no way to have a cryptocurrency without the belief that and the cryptographic theorems that were proved to enable it. And what does it mean, cryptocurrency? It means that you cannot double spend your money, that you will not, a transaction will not be honored unless you have the money, and so forth. And this is done in totally distributed fashion without a centralized authority. So all of these things are enabled by cryptography, and I won't explain how. Another thing is cloud computing. So these days, we really think about this idea that when computations are too complex, let's say in machine learning, as it is today at least, you need a lot of compute power. You need a lot of processors. And people don't have that. If you want to use it, if in the future you want to enable it, you will have to give it out to be processed. So how are you going to do that and trust that what comes back is correct and that you've kept your privacy? Again, these are some things that in principle can be done because we can process things out of our hand in maintaining privacy and also proving the correctness. And then I have here, this is like a quantum computer, at least what I found on the internet, is that good. Whatever. And why cryptography has to do with enabling quantum computing, that's a stretch. But what I guess, in my mind, I think that Peter Shor's algorithm for factoring integers on a quantum computer, which was a theoretical result, okay, on paper, with the theoretical model of a quantum machine, I think goes back to late 80s or something like that? 94, okay. From where I sit, 10 years is roughly the same. So in any case, Peter Shor's algorithm really brought a lot of interest in this. It's like, wow, this can break RSA, this can break electronic commerce, let's pay attention. And I think certainly the case that the physics community got a lot of funding for it. And then that means a lot of research has been done, and it's gone quite a long way. So from that point of view, the way I see it, it's had a big impact. And the next frontiers, which is the rest of my talk, is that I believe that cryptography and a lot of things that we've already known, some things we're still yet to prove, is going to enable what I called in my title safe machine learning, and I'll try to explain a little bit because it's actually a whole talk, separate talk, and obviously I won't be able to give it, and also enable compliance with law and new law, as I was talking about in the beginning of the talk. So let me dedicate the rest of my talk to these two things. Questions? No. Okay, so let's start with this machine learning and cryptography. So again, I can't help but go back to the past a little bit. I remember that when I was studying, sorry for these personal anecdotes, but people always tell you have to know your history in order to be able to do the future. And as a young person, it seemed to me complete nonsense. In fact, I kind of believe that you shouldn't know the history in order to come up with creative new ideas. But by now, I believe that to some extent it's true, at least for talks. So in any case, in the 80s, so the relationship between machine learning and cryptography is not a new thing. So in the 80s, it was very tight, I think, community, at least in the theory world. But essentially what one could prove was if something is hard for one of these fields, it's bliss for the other. So if a cryptographic task is possible, it means that there's some machine learning that cannot be done. If some task can be learned, it means that there's some crypto problem that's been broken. So it was always sort of working at odds with each other, okay? And today, I think that it's actually going to work together. So in order to get safe machine learning, actually, the better cryptography we have, the better we can do. So again, for those of you in the audience that this needs explaining, what do I even mean by machine learning? From a sort of theory point of view, without thinking about cars that drive or prediction of death or health and so forth. So we have a box. There's some black box. It sits in there as some complicated formula or less complicated formula. And this box, I'll call it C, it's like it could be used to answer some amazing things, like whether your email is spam, whether a tumor is malignant, whether a student should be admitted to college, whether a bank loan should be accepted. There's some black box that can make the determination. Given the x's, the right parameters, it can tell, if you are, I don't know, what's the least problematic here? If the email contains, I don't know, some words, some very provocative terms, then it's spam, okay? And the terms are what the inputs are. And a bank loan might be where you live, what your credit history is, and so forth. And based on this, they decide, I give you a loan, I don't give you a loan, okay? Now, it would be great to be able to learn this, obviously. Or should a suspect be released on bail, right? We would love to learn how this determination should happen. So I'm thinking about the black's ideal box, not how the bank does it. Ideally, what's the right way to answer? Whether one should get a loan or not, one should be treated for malignancy or not, and so forth. So we'd love to learn C, but all we have are examples. So we know what the input is, we know what the box at the end, what the determination was. Somebody faulted on a loan, somebody committed a crime when they're out of jail, somebody had a cancer, where the input was an MRI possibly. But how do we actually learn it without figure out what the internals are? So of course this means that you need to define what exactly you know about this hidden box, what is the query model? Is it you can put inputs and get outputs out? Do you just get examples of input-outputs and you can't actually feed it? And also, what do you mean by successfully learn it? You may mean that you want to come up with a box that's pretty close to this one. Okay, so it kind of approximates the truth. You may mean that you want to generate it. You want to generate outputs of this box. Okay. So, for example, people talk in AI these days about generating speech or generating false cats. I'm not sure. Shimon could tell us why is the fascination with generating artificial cats. In the Weizmann Institute, we have enough real cats, it seems to me, to supply to anybody who's interested. But I've never seen so many cats in my life. But in any case, it's not Veer. Or things like explain properties of this box. You know, what's an average? What's a first moment of this box? You know, is it differentiable, and so forth. Okay. So we may want to be many things out of this access to this box. And basically, there was this paper in '84 which had a theory of what's learnable. This is a paper by Valiant, and he essentially put into mathematics what right now seems totally obvious, but at the time was a beautiful definition and a new definition. You're given examples of C, and a successful learning algorithm will generate an hypothesis, okay, that agrees with C approximately and with high probability. So the name was called PAC, probability and probably and approximately correct. So this is just putting it into mathematics. So the number of mistakes is small, and that's true with high probability. And Valiant was very optimistic at the time. For example, for these type of boxes, which have sort of simple logic, it's called DNF, and but the progress has been slow. So you know, over the years, very slowly, by increasing assumptions, sort of what kind of distribution, what kind of access do you have to the box, and so forth. Finally, you could do something. Okay, so it's not as optimistic as what Valiant predicted, and in fact, in terms of the connection to cryptography, what really immediately fascinated cryptographers is what can't you do what can't you learn, and it was. You know, in some sense, I think that probably is the case because Valiant was at Harvard and Rivest was at MIT, and they were friends. This is like '84 or something. And so it was kind of, these communities talked to each other. And it was shown very quickly by actually Valiant, and never mind, it's a bunch of theorems here, that PAC learnability is crypto hard for many query models. So in other words, if cryptography exists, if factoring integers is hard, or if some other cryptographic tasks are difficult, then you cannot PAC learn, you cannot do what Valiant wants to do for a bunch of tasks. Okay, let's just skip ahead. And then in this conference in '93, sort of machine learning returned the favor. So this was cryptographers telling machine learning people that you can't do this. And they say, you know, all these tasks, all these proofs that can't do come from cryptography. Here's a learning task, okay? And it's hard for us. Maybe it's going to be useful for you. Maybe you can use this learning task as a basis for cryptographic systems, to build encryption systems, to build cryptography from something that's hard for us. So not only that you're going to show us things that are hard, here's something that really comes from the natural, at least our world, and it's hard, and maybe you can use it. And this problem was the following problem. It's called learning parity with noise, which is, there's a bunch of equations, okay? These are secrets. S1, S2, S3 are secrets. There's a bunch of equations in these secrets that are given to you. This is the learning task, is to learn the secret, okay? The thing is that obviously if you just had equations, you could solve it doing Gaussian elimination, so it was with noise. So you didn't actually get correct answers, but you get some sort of erroneous answers to these equations. Okay, and this was a task that came from learning theory. It seemed to be difficult, still difficult today. In fact, very difficult. So best algorithm is exponential, already from 2003. It's also a beautiful problem for other reasons. It has sort of this worst case to average difficulty. But the main importance of this problem is that Oded Regev in Tel Aviv in 2005 came up with a generalization of this problem. So rather than just having these equations where the coefficients were 0, 1, he said, why don't we take the secret not to just be 0, 1, but a secret over ZQ, so it's numbers, okay, mod, it's large numbers. And now we have these equations again, but rather than having, you know, there's 14, 15, 5, 2, it's not just 0, 1. And the noise now is just not flipping zeros to ones, but sort of giving some Gaussian noise. And he says, here's a problem. It can't be any easier than the previous one because it's a generalization of it. But the interesting thing is that it's a much better problem to work with for cryptographers. So it has been sort of revolutionary in cryptography. So a problem that originated from learning has enabled something called homomorphic encryption, leakage resilient crypto, attribute encryption, and much more. Okay. Now, in a minute, we'll get to something that the general public can follow, I promise. There's also quantum significance to this problem. What's the quantum significance? So, as probably been discussed in the previous talks, these days, quantum computing, in some sense, is going commercial. I mean, in addition to the beautiful theory that's been developed, companies such as Google, Microsoft, IBM, and many others, as well as governments, are sort of racing toward building a quantum computer. Whether they will achieve it or not achieve it, whether it will be a universal computer or it be able to do certain tasks, there's certainly the race is on, and a lot of money is being invested in it. So, going back to electronic commerce and these things that we've gotten used to it, what if in 10, 20 years it will not, these things that we based it on, like factoring is hard and so forth, is not hard anymore because there are these quantum adversaries. So our adversary changes from classical to quantum. So indeed, the National Institute of Standards, the NSA in the United States, they've started planning for what they call post-quantum cryptography. So this age where we can't trust anymore the kind of systems we have and have to have new systems. We cannot use reverse engineered atom on RSA. We cannot use Diffie-Hellman. For people who know what that is, we must be cognizant of the fact that there might be a common computer out there that can break our systems. So what are we going to do? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to be very happy that we have mathematicians and there's investment in basic science and there's theory around, because it turned out that irrelevant to this problem was not around. Quantum computing and the building of quantum computers was not actually out there. There's this whole theory by Miklos Aitai from '96, which said that here's a new form of cryptography, which is not using number theory and factoring integers and RSA, but it uses geometry. Okay, and it's called lattices, geometry of lattices, and this really took the CS theory world by storm, and lots of new cryptographic constructions, capabilities came about, and to my point, all of them are quantum resilient. So it turned out that this body of mathematics that was invented just because of pure sort of aesthetics will solve a problem we never thought we were going to have, which is that there might be quantum computers, they might break our number theory-based things, and we can use this instead. And, yeah?
Are there real systems that use geometry-based?
Oh, of course, I'm not saying any kind of geometry. I'm saying that in particular his system it talks about hard problems on lattices, and I would define that as part of geometry in place of number theory. I'm not saying that everything, what do you mean? Ask the question again.
Okay, like we have RSA, I'm asking if we have other real...
Yes, that's what I'm saying in this slide. Okay, I am saying that because of this theory that Aitai started, okay, and because of the next slide I'm going to show in a minute, and that is that Regev, when he introduced this problem, okay, he actually also proved that it was equivalent to one of those Aitai systems. So the Aitai systems, let's say, can be shown that we don't know how to attack them with quantum computers. And they are sort of, you can describe them as a geometric system. It's geometry, sort of the base elements that you're working with are geometric operations, and the hard problems are sort of problems that can be defined in terms of pictures and geometry. But in addition, it turns out that they're actually equivalent to that number, that problem that I introduced before with equations and so forth. And the best known algorithm for breaking them is exponential, and this is sort of due to the Aitai thing from before. So, in other words, to answer your question, yes, there exist systems. They are actually enable cryptography we do not know how to do in number theory, in addition to what we do know how to do with number theory. They are quantum resilient in the sense that we have absolutely no idea how to attack them. And not only that, it's just a slow polynomial or a naive, a harmless exponential, but really the best algorithms we have are exponential, which means that right now we feel safe. And furthermore, as I'll say in a few minutes, it's not just that they're on paper, but people are building these systems. They're out there, they're packages, they're libraries, and so forth. That was your question? Okay. But in any case, so far still, it was sort of the bliss for cryptography is a nightmare for machine learning, you know? Hard problem one, I don't know if people remember this from Saturday Night Live 30 years ago maybe. There was this character called Debbie Downer that everything's, but it's not so good. Anyway, so my last part of the talk, I want to say that these impossibility results, or the fact that hard for one is good for the other, is actually positive news. So if we switch sort of to what's happening today, we're talking about the fact that there's a lot of data out there and it can change everything, right? It can change health, you know, things that Aviv was talking about and Ron Shamir, disease control by trend prediction or correlations between genetics and medication and other health records. You know, in finance, we know that it can do predictions for financial markets, with the it's economic growth, the ad model, infrastructure, traffic patterns, you know, or energy use, vision, facial and image recognition, natural language understanding. As yesterday, Amnon said that he felt that this was really the next frontier. I mean, so there's many things we know, but not enough. Insecurity, threat prediction models, policing, decide which neighborhood to police. So that's really something that's more recent. These three things. So in the US, there's some police cars, in fact, quite common at this point, that will it will use a system to tell them where to send police cars since there's a limited supply, to which neighborhood, and this is based on predictions from the past of where crime is taking place, depending on a variety of factors, to decide who is a flight risk in terms of bail. You know, in California now they've switched the bail system. This is just passed from bail that was money related, so you give different amount of money. Anybody said that one? A different amount of money to different offenders to go out on bail. Now it's a yes/no. Either they let them out or not, and it's going to be based on an automatic system that advises the judge whether someone is a flight risk or not. A credit rating, decide who gets a loan, use an algorithm for it. And as I said, I think that in New Jersey, the bail thing is actually in place. It's in Louisiana, New Orleans. They have this system for deciding where to send the police cars. There was some other thing there that I wanted to put. But in any case, my point is that of this slide is that all of a sudden there's this sudden shift of power. So before that, we had people making decisions based on fairly limited data. Now we have these huge amounts of data. We have this fantastic way to automate. And that's all good. On the other hand, it poses the fact that, you know, things are going into somebody else's hands. Because a very interesting question is that we rarely ask as academics is who is writing these systems? That's another question. So for example, in California now they have, for this law of bail, now it's a law. Now you have to have the software. So they have, I don't know, $75 million out for private companies to compete for writing the software. And then there's another $75 million for companies who will make sure that the software of those first companies is correct, okay? Who are these people? So, I mean, I don't know. But we certainly need methods to verify that all this is sound. So in any case, there is a shift of power, whether it is to the people who implemented the algorithm, or people who verified that the implementation is correct. And all of this is based on data that is ours. So if we go back to this right to be left alone, far from it. In fact, there is this slide that I stole from one of my colleagues that says that even if you look at sort of largest companies by market cap, it used to be oil companies. These days, it's all data companies. So in some sense, there's this phrase, the same data is the new currency or the new oil. And as we know, money talks or corrupts or both. And I think that it can leave us unprotected, unregulated, and this is where, and this is not just, you know, sort of like paranoid musings, but we already know these kind of things. You know, DNA tests, you know, cause some kid to be expelled from school. Your relative's DNA could turn you into a suspect. I think there was cases that this has actually brought people to justice, but sometimes, you know, maybe it sounds good, but you can obviously see the bad part. So my thesis is that using cryptographic tools and models we developed in the last 30, 40 years, both for privacy and correctness of computation, can go a long way towards safe machine learning. So what is a safe machine learning? I talk so much about definitions, but I haven't defined it. And I'm not going to define it, because I think to too new a task. So I could list you 10 challenges that if you solve them, machine learning will be safer. But I don't have time to list you 10 challenges, so I'll just talk about 2. So one of them is, since the power of machine learning comes from data of individuals, how about ensuring that the privacy of the data and even the model the hypothesis that you've learned from the data during both the training and classifying. So I didn't say what about training and classifying. Training is you get a lot of data and you sort of, of examples to that box, okay, and then you come up with a hypothesis. That's the training phase. And classifying is actually you use the box. Somebody has that model. You give your input. You say, am I credit worthy? And then they say, yes, no. Meanwhile, you give them all your data. So the one goal is to somehow enable both the training of these machine learning models and using them while maintaining your privacy. So it's sort of a black box. I put my input. Nobody really looks at my input and comes out a decision. Okay? So they don't see my input, and yet I have the benefit of getting the decision of whether my tumor is malignant and so forth. And the second thing, so this will go a long way, in my opinion, to maintain this sort of power to the people thing, rather than power to the big companies, okay? And the second thing is that, let's say the model has been developed. Somebody had a great machine learning algorithm. They saw lots of pictures of MRI and whether someone became ill. And now they have a fantastic way to diagnose. And this is their intellectual property, in a sense. I mean, they came up with it. So how... on one hand, you don't want somebody to steal it. On the other hand, you want to make sure that this model is not really tampered, so that it's valid, so they didn't try to make it better than it is, so that it's consistent with the data. Why do we believe that's consistent with the data? There's huge potential here for profit. If it wasn't necessarily consistent with the data and you rounded the corners, in Hebrew, that's the right phrase. But in any case, so you want to be able to efficiently prove to a client that the model is consistent with the reported data, maintaining privacy. So this is a proof. Again, you want to be able to prove something is true, but not in the sense of the mathematical theorem saying that Pythagoras' sentence is correct or that I know a password, but let's say that a model is consistent with a large amount of data that a database that you can sample. Okay, so what is, how are you going to do that? So these are the only 2 challenges I'm going to talk about. Obviously, it's not just cryptography. So things like developing methods to minimize the influence of maliciously chosen training data is extremely important job for optimization theory. So how are we going to do that? Essentially, the way that these days people are addressing it is they use techniques from the past. Probably the 2 techniques that they mostly use is something called multi-party computation, where it's possible using crypto to enable a bunch of databases to send messages to each other and at the end to make a conclusion without actually sending each other the data. Or there's something, and another thing, there's something called homomorphic encryption, which allows you to encrypt all your data, send it out to the cloud, say, or someone else to compute on it, and then they just give you the result to decrypt. Okay? So these are 2 technologies we know from crypto, and they can go a long way to make machine learning of the type that I want, which is safe, namely the privacy of the data, privacy of the model, and also accuracy with respect to samples. So I just want to say that interestingly, this multi-party computation, been known to me how that happened, has made it to a bill to Congress, in the United States Congress, and you don't need to know a definition to read this. It says the term secure multi-party computation means a computerized system that enables different participating entities in possession of private sets of data to link and aggregate their data sets for the exclusive purpose of performing a finite number of pre-approved computation without transferring or otherwise revealing any private data to each other or anyone else. It's pretty good. So this is taking the math and putting it into words and putting it into law, or at least attempting to put it into a bill. Indeed, these 2 tools, multi-party computation and homomorphic encryption, have been used for, these days there are systems out there for classification, namely being able to feed something to a model, a machine learning model, and get an answer without actually a machine learning model looking at the data in the clear. It's really pick and choose of the existing crypto model, encrypting building blocks with ion performance to make sure that you get the right thing to get the performance. Training machine learning models is much harder. There's a lot more computation at stake here. Computational, even though in theory you can do it computationally, much harder. So what people are doing is they're saying, well, let's just, in machine learning in general, the answer is approximate. So you sort of guaranteeing statistical performance. You're not guaranteeing performance per input. So in that case, we can sort of relax also the crypto to deliver less, and then we might be able to do it fast and train a model that's maybe not as accurate as without cryptography, but close enough. So that's kind of the approach out there. And there's also something called differential privacy, which is extremely useful here. Shimon, how much time? I'm done? No, I'm not done. I have to get to law. So wait a second. So we'll jump over the how it's used for classifying, the thing that I alluded to. For example, the example that I was giving there was that in a neural net, you say where you have the levels, the linear levels, then nonlinear functions. In the intermediate levels, one of the sort of, I think, most interesting system around is called Gazelle, by Nathan and other people in MIT, where they sort of switch between layers, different technology. And then that way they can actually do convolutional neural nets. Now they're doing other things, alternating the crypto that you're using. And there are actually libraries with support for these layers. So, even though for a long time this was just proof of concept, in the sense that there was let's say theory papers in the 80s, and then there were sort of papers that talk about parameters and efficiency in the 90s, and then there were proof of concept little systems. These days, really, we have libraries, out there which you can actually get off the web and try to play with them and use them. Okay, so I didn't talk much about zero-knowledge proofs or law, and that's what I'll talk about next. So what zero-knowledge proof enables, essentially, in a word, is somehow to decouple the verifying correctness from knowledge of the proofs. Somehow you're going to believe it's correct without knowing anything else, okay? All right, what does this have to do with law? And developed in '85, and I was going to give you some hint of how, but let's ignore that. What about usages? That's mostly what I'd like to just say for the last few words. So there's been a lot of uses in cryptography. Probably the most famous one is in '85 by Adi Shamir and Fiat about how to protect, this is useful for protecting against identity theft. So if you can prove that you're the right person, you know password, without giving it, then it's harder, obviously, to steal your identity. But like in 2014, there was a paper that from a cryptographer in Boaz Barak, who got his PhD in Weizmann, and some physicists in Princeton about how to use zero-knowledge principles for nuclear disarmament. People want to ask me in the break, I'll explain. And then in 2016, there is a company called Zcash, where they show how to do cryptocurrency, which also protect the anonymity and privacy of transactions. So this is going very much to the commercial world. And this is, again, Technion, Eli Ben-Sasson, Berkeley, Alessandro Chiesa, and some other people. So it's collaboration between an Israeli and American institute. Many of these things are, interestingly. Israel and the US are very strong in cryptography, and have a lot of collaborations because people were educated in similar places. But getting to law, this last application is a paper, some papers that I'm involved in, and the subject is the following. So in the US, there's a lot of surveillance. In Israel, it's no question, but in the US, we write papers about this, where the FBI can go to the government, the federal judge, and say, I'd like to get surveillance on someone. And this happens. And there is really no, by law, these things, after 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, there's an expiration. It's supposed to be exposed, of course, not during the investigation. But it turns out that there's this guy called Judge Smith, who wrote in Texas, there were lots of papers about this, is that the judges routinely do not open up the surveillance. So they, in perpetuity, this is secret. Now, his argument is why that's not okay is both, one, because there is no checks and balances. Nobody knows really what's going on. And second of all, that the American law, at least, it's all case law in some sense, based on case law. So you have no way to scrutinize what's happening. You have no way to change the law if you haven't been exposed to how it's been used. The only really system of checks and balances on this kind of thing is that companies like Facebook or Google or Microsoft and so forth, they release reports at the end of the year, how many surveillance requests they answer to. How many times they let numbers, okay? And this gives you some sort of estimate of the magnitude of the problem, which is thousands and thousands, but there's no way to check that these reports are accurate. There's no way to check whether the requests for surveillance were for why. Is it because you are suspected to be a sex offender and you're doing child pornography? Are you a suspected terrorist? Is it just the government thinks that you are associating with people of irreputable whatever, reputation. Does that make sense? You understand. So there is no breakdown. And there's no accuracy in the check, and there's no breakdown, and there's no comparison of one company versus the other. So the question is, can you use cryptography, the tools that we have, to change the state of affairs? So can you somehow prove compliance, in this case the government compliance, with the law? And in fact, there's even a body of secret laws in the US. This is in order to do surveillance on foreign nationals, where there are courts that decide that it's okay to do surveillance, but they don't say why. And there's not even a body of law, but it's more policy, which kind of reminds you of the Kafka things. You know, our laws are not generally known. They're kept secret by a small group of nobles who rule us. We're convinced that these ancient laws are scrupulously administered. Nevertheless, it's an extremely painful thing to be ruled by laws that one does not understand. So I think it's extremely relevant to this situation. And we built a system to the point where we actually implemented, and this Judge Smith is trying to get it passed across in some way, where the judges, when they are asking the courts, the police got an order from a judge, but the judge, when he gives a surveillance order, when it allows it, he also reports it to the district court, which is sort of, there are 12 courts of this, and this is a small enough system that they can do multi-party computation and collect aggregate statistics without revealing anything about which judge this came from, but they can reveal extremely important information, like what kind of was that this is not the only, so this is interesting, right? So I think you can use cryptography to enforce something that the law claims that they are following, but you can enforce it. But there are other things that are, I mentioned this interest in law and algorithms, or law and cryptography. So what are other examples that one can think of? So one can think of, and this is something that some people at Berkeley are working on, is this idea that these days, I understand the jury in the United States, all what happens in the jury room is supposed to be secret, it's supposed to be a black box. That's what you want. I think by definition, you're not supposed to know what's going on. On the other hand, what's going on? So, I mean, in the sense of, is it okay what's going on? So you can imagine the idea of checking that there's some basic rules that are being followed without actually seeing at all what happens in the jury room. Or a judge, he gets documents that he can look at to determine that they're not relevant to the case, okay? But he's looking at the documents, okay? So there is exposure, even though the only bit out of it is it relevant or not relevant? Can it be shown or cannot it be shown? Even that is something that you can imagine, that you don't let the judge have this ability to look at it. Okay, another example is tax laws, you know, tax returns compliance, which is something that, you know, kind of making sure democracy is in play without violating the details of exposing. In elections, there's many, many ways where there are sort of legal requirements which cannot be really implemented in the physical world as is. And therefore, everything seems to me, at least when I read these laws, when I talk to lawyers, it's not very mathematically defined, right? It's not mathematically defined. In fact, you're not allowed to use a number. You can't say he's guilty 90% of the time, or with 90% certainty, because immediately that's subject to be thrown out of court. So that means 10% not guilty. So there's all these things, okay, that we in computer science, it's very clear to us that we need numbers, we need definitions, we need proofs. And I think that the lawyers are very interested in how we speak, and we're very interested in how they speak. So I think that, you know, we've seen some of this today, fairness, when Omer talked about the notion of fairness of computer scientists and lawyers. And Amnon Shashua yesterday talking about safety and what he feels it means safe and what a law would define as safe. So it comes in fairness of algorithms, safety, privacy. Michal might have other examples. But in all of these, there's some sort of legal doctrine that governs the law that's relevant. And then there's computer science techniques to govern it, and the question is how to talk to each other so we understand each other. And there's going to be a workshop, right, that Michal in Val here and I are arranging in Dagstuhl and in Simon's, right, which I'm the director of. Okay, thank you.